Hello again everybody. Well, turning away from Roman cooking, I'm now going to turn to the history of the Jews and their interaction with the classical world, both the Greek world, or Greek-speaking world, and the Roman world. So the first part of this is going to be about the Maccabean Revolt of the 2nd century BC. But first of all, a bit of background. After the death of Alexander the Great, in 323 BC, there was dispute between some of his generals and about who was going to take on his mantle. There were basically three of these. There was Antigonus I, sometimes called Antigonus the One-Eyed. There was Seleucus and the Seleucus I, and there was Ptolemy I. Ptolemy established himself in Egypt, and the Ptolemies reigned until Cleopatra, who was the last of the Ptolemies, who died in 30 BC. Antigonus is relatively unimportant because he didn't last that long and he didn't have that much influence, because Seleucus, who fought against Antigonus, established his primacy in the Middle East. Seleucus actually tried to reenact some of what Alexander did, marched eastwards over the Hindu Kush mountains into India, but didn't really establish anything long-lasting there. Anyway, the interesting bit for us is that Seleucus established the Seleucid dynasty, which dominated the Middle East for a couple of hundred years or so. Within his province, right at the edge of his province, was Judea, and this was at the edge of also of the Ptolemaic influence. So there was conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and in the 2nd century BC this was quite important. So there were a number of Seleucids who followed on from Seleucus I, but there were several kings who were called Antiochus. Antiochus 1, 2 and 3 were quite interesting in their own right, but the one we're interested in today is Antiochus IV, so-called Epiphanes, which means God made manifest, something like that. And there was internal conflict within the province of Judea, also called Judah by the Jews, between those who were prepared to compromise with the Hellenizers, with those who wanted to accept some Greek culture, and those who were more orthodox. And Antiochus got himself involved in this. He was not very sympathetic towards the Jews, it has particularly the Orthodox side, and so he got involved in this in a pretty unpleasant way. Now, it's unusual for this incident that we actually have three sources, one of them classical, one of them apocryphal, and one of them from the Old Testament. First of all, the classical one. Now, this comes from Diodorus the Sicilian, who's quoting an earlier writer called Posidonius, and he was writing in connection with an earlier incident. So that's what this says. They also reminded him of his ancestors' previous aversion from this nation, for Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, after vanquishing the Jews, entered the innermost sanctuary of their god, which it was lawful only for the priest to enter. In it he found a stone statue of a man with a long beard, seated on an ass and holding a book in his hands. He assumed that this was the statue of Moses, who founded Jerusalem and formed the nation, and also enacted for the Jews their misanthropic and lawless customs. Well, that idea of misanthropic and lawless customs means the Jews separating themselves off and wanting to run their own affairs and live by their own laws. So from a classical point of view, they didn't like the Jews much at that time because they weren't prepared to be classical enough. Now, our second source is the book of Daniel, but I'm not going to talk much about Daniel today. So the third source is from the Old Testament Apocrypha, and this is from the second book of Maccabees. And this is what that says. Shortly afterwards, King Antiochus sent an elderly Athenian to force the Jews to abandon their ancestral customs and no longer regulate their lives according to the laws of God. He also was also commissioned to pollute the temple at Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and to dedicate the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, god of hospitality, following the practice of the local inhabitants. This evil hit them hard, and was a severe trial. The Gentiles filled the temple with licentious revelry, They took their pleasures with prostitutes and defiled the sacred precincts. They also brought forbidden things inside, heaped the altar with impure offerings prohibited by the law. It was forbidden either to observe the Sabbath or to keep the traditional festivals or to admit being a Jew at all. On the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were driven by force to eat the entrails of the sacrificial victims, and on the feast of Dionysus they were forced to wear ivy wreaths and join the procession in his honour. Well, pretty much all of that would have been absolute anathema to any self-respecting Jew. Nonetheless, some of the Hellenizers were prepared to compromise with Antiochus, not least the high priest Jason. And this then led to severe conflict with the more orthodox, led by Maccabeus, who came from just outside Jerusalem. He killed the Hellenizer and his Greek guard, and then he and his companions escaped into the desert. They were joined by some other pious believers called the Hasidians, who were ultimately the origin of the modern Hasidic movement, who refused to fight on the Sabbath, and the Greeks, knowing this, they just massacred them. So that didn't go too well. So Maccabeus eventually died in 166 BC, and he was succeeded by Judas, known as Maccabeus, which is a nickname, and which means the hammer. He was a very devout man, but also practical. He succeeded after a guerrilla campaign in recapturing Jerusalem in 164 BC. One of the key things that he did was rededicate the temple and relight the menorah candlestick using oil which had been miraculously preserved, and this is still commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. There were some negotiations between him and the Greeks, and there were some because the Greeks had kind of lost interest with these troublesome Jews. There were also negotiations with Rome, who was beginning to exert influence in the Middle East. Judas died 5 years after he began fighting. Antiochus Epiphanes also died. Judas was succeeded by Jonathan. He upset some traditionalists in accepting some compromises with the Hellenizers, but he also upset them because he was not from the line of Aaron, which high priests were supposed to be. He was actually a Hasmonean, and this established the Hasmonean dynasty of high priests for some decades after that. He was more or less accommodated within the Greek and Roman world, and the Jews were more or less allowed to run their own affairs, and this went on with a sort of uneasy peace. But given that Greece had been taken, and the Greek world taken by the Romans in 146 BC, sooner or later there was going to come to be conflict with the Romans, which we shall explore in the next of these talks.